I'm chatting. Some of you might have heard or seen on your table earlier this year we had a magnificent crusade, took a bunch of Westies to East London. For those old enough in the room to know the reference, it was a bit of like a Basil Mackenzie tour we're afraid of, but they all behaved very well. They were even very polite and kind in Australia House, and it worked out to be a wonderful, wonderful journey. People asked why would we take Western Sydney to East London? And for me it was in a way the bleeding obvious. The similar geography, the culture, the politics. And in a way, when we think of modern Western Sydney, and it's two cities, the Central River City and the Western Parkland City, we're probably more talking about the Central River City, the established brownfields, post-war suburban boom part of Sydney. Where there's not a lot of green left in East London, which is further afield. But you think of the waves they've been through. It started with the development of Docklands, the Canary Wharf, the skyscrapers of Canary Wharf, which in hindsight was probably too private sector and not enough government in it as it's come round. The kick-on that came from Docklands Light Rail, the access that came from that and the Jubilee line into the Tube into the east. Hosting an Olympic Games, as Western Sydney had done effectively, ours in 2000, theirs in 2012. And now Crossrail, the mega project like our combo of metros and airports that are the incredible turbochargers of urban renewal. So when we decided to go to East London, who would we take? Well, we carefully curated not only a program but a cohort. Sought people out by invitation that could be part of our team that went forth. You see the good-looking men and women of Western Sydney on the screen there. But we took mayors, we took vice-chancellors, we took secretaries of departments, CEOs of companies. We took our very own Reverend, where's Reverend Cruz? Bill Cruz, who's here over the side, the saint of Ashfield and now Liverpool. We took Billy Sankovic representing the community forum in Western Sydney. We took educators from a number of institutions. It was an incredible cohort, a leadership cohort of Western Sydney, a mix of public and private, consultants and otherwise. Importantly, we also took 2 graduate students with us because, as I said last night, it's not enough for old white men like me to work out the future of Western Sydney, but the people who will live it, the future leaders, people like Andrew Fong and Lakshmi Lagathasan who came with us as well to pay testimony to the next generation of Western Sydney leaders. Importantly, there's 2 people. We had an incredible steering committee that gave us advice, and people like John Lamont of Sydney Metro and Sarah Hill from the Greater Sydney Commission, and a range of some of which are here today. But 2 of them I want to pay particular tribute to. Tim Williams, who we awarded last night our collaboration award for his time at Committee for Sydney. But incredibly, the work Tim did with me, he came with me on a recce trip to London to understand it, having been largely in my role in East London many years earlier, and what an asset he was, and I knew he would be when we got there. And we also took a bloke called John Burton, who's joining us on the panel, now running Lead Lease's Urban Regeneration, but in those days was in charge of Westfield in that part of the world and largely built that Stratford incredible base, a shopping centre at the base of an urban renewal. And to be there and see the esteem in which John and Tim are both held by the locals, knew that we were in good stead, and our ambassadors went before us. That opened up an incredible range of people who would meet with us and talk to us. But importantly, this worked because they left their egos behind. The cohort were amazing. They turned up to everything, they asked all the questions, and it wasn't your normal jolly study tour. We're talking 7 events per day for 5 days, and the only complaint was, could we stop flogging them and let them have some time off? But I think what we have developed is an alumni culture, this collaborative leadership culture that came out of these guys working together. So where do we go? We went wherever we could. We can go by rail, and that was an early learning getting there. Throw the coach out the window and get on the tube, get on the light rail and get around and see what an accessible city could be, what an accessible Western Sydney could be if we had the same level and when we had the same level of transport accessibility. Our view of East London, as we've often tried to define Western Sydney, we defined East London as east of the Tower Bridge and both sides of the Thames, north and south of the Thames. So that great sway from Whitechapel out to Barking. Those music fans know Barking famous where Billy Bragg comes from, but also the most amazing mayor in London that we dealt with, who was just transforming his own city by force of personality. So it was tremendous to see all the sites across all of East London to get around. We got lucky, not a single transport strike or a drop of rain in a week in London, and who's ever had that experience? Which helped. Who did we meet with? Well, East London opened up their brains trust to us, from deputy mayors, the head of the London Assembly, the ultimate political insiders at City Hall, barons and baronesses. I've never dealt with so much nobility in my life. A kid from Western Sydney don't deal with sirs and barons and earls and lords on a daily basis. But guess what? They're all pretty good people. They were all down to earth. I liked them. They must have been Labor lords, I imagine. But they were all they were remarkably generous. We deliberately sought out the people who started this journey, not only the existing custodians, but the ones who started way back in the day, the original Deputy CEO of Canary Wharf, the original CEO of Committee for London, the original planners of the boroughs, the former Mayor of Newham, an amazing character he was, to ask them deliberately not only what you get right, what you get wrong. We're going to make some stumbles in our journey about urban renewal of Western Sydney. We're going to get some stuff wrong. But to learn from their mistakes, and generously they didn't hide those errors and open up to all of us. I particularly want to thank our partners in that process too. A couple of things you might have heard of: the Australian government, the New South Wales government, who collaborated themselves to help get our team to London, and NAB, the great bank, is taking 3,000 staff to Parramatta in short time to have their support behind us. It was tremendous, and particularly Western Sydney University, Andy Marks, Barney Glover, and the team, who were so helpful for us taking it forward. One particular pleasurable thing I had to do there was we gave some awards away last night, but one we couldn't do here because he's based in London. We had the great pleasure to present the inaugural Global Leadership Award for the Western Sydney Leadership Dialogue to Dan Labad, who's recently retired as the head of Lend-Lease in London, having been one of the towering figures in the rebuild of that city. Just like our own Adam Leto, a kid from Fairfield, who's now been poached to go and run a thing called the Crown Estate. It's a minor exercise. It's the property holdings of the Queen and the UK government. He owns the entire shoreline of the United Kingdom and half of downtown London. An incredible, one of the most prestigious property jobs on earth. I'm reliably informed he has to drop a bit of coin, but he might be the first Sedan of Fairfield we've ever known if and when he does it well. But an amazing man, and he spoke at a dinner we had to all the cohort about the need of corporate leadership, of the partnership he had and others like John Hads, David Higgins had in their roles in London, the partnership between business and the private sector was essential in getting it done, as governments start to realise that often the private sector can deal with the community even better than the government can, and learning from each other. So it was a great success, great honour to be able to present that award to Dan. So what do we learn in East London that we didn't already know? We learned it's expensive to get there and expensive to get home, but I learned the hard way when I missed my flight coming back. Importantly, we learned collaboration and good governance has to be your mantra. You cannot do this alone. It's a message I put to the Premier last night, almost urging, how can we better build the private sector back into the business? How do we build community sector, not only into community housing, but in other parts, into the business of city shaping? I love the fact we've got this mercantile Liberal government running the greatest left-wing public works agenda we've ever seen. It's a tremendous gift from God of taxpayer money going to infrastructure. But this room's full of people who want to do more, who want to play a bigger role, who, notwithstanding the constraints of probity, how can we recalibrate silly probity to only be good probity? How can we have meetings with people in the Great City Commission without paying 3 probity orders sitting in the room when you're talking public policy? You're not approving a property, you're not doing a deal. We have to be able to have proper discussions about city shaping that gives a role for the government. And we saw that in East London as a very bedrock of how they've achieved that. We heard a manifestation of that. Famous line out of our meeting with the chairman and CEO of Crossrail, the new chairman and CEO of Crossrail, because the last ones both got fired because it stumbled towards the end of its near development. And this concept of 2 pennies in the pound that the business lobby group, that London First, the equivalent of the Committee for London, the Committee for Sydney, put to government, put a levy on us of 2 pennies in the pound in the City of London, which raised $4.2 billion to help fund Crossrail. Classic, wonderful business leadership and classic, wonderful collaboration to take a project forward that was in everyone's interest that gets built. I still can't believe we just can't find a way to do value capture in our city, and we have to find a way. We have to get through that. And local government reform. I don't want to go back to boundary changes again. They're very hard to manage in a city like ours, but we saw the strong mayor concept. Mayors and leaders of councils having more authority, more resources to drive projects forward. There's a few of those tried in Sydney, but the constraints of local government make that very difficult. We've got to get a more mature approach to state and local government, how we can manage that. I pay credit to the work Lindy Dietz and the mayor of Campbelltown yesterday, putting the front foot forward on fast rail, just as Parramatta is now doing as well, and others. Second major learning, skills and jobs, the greatest legacy. I know it sounds obvious, but to remind every day that we saw examples, winners and losers in London. The wonderful Canary Wharf looked shiny and magnificent, tall towers and lots of banker jobs, but the people of Shadwell, on the poverty line right next door, didn't get a job out of it. It was badly managed and by admission of Canary Wharf. Whereas with Stratford was done, a much more collaborative approach working the local community around the Olympics. So there were job opportunities planned and promised and delivered to local communities. So it not only actually made step change in the communities they were trying to affect, it also brought the community with them and made life a lot easier for the developers and regulators. So it's really important to get that legacy early and to premeditate your legacy. With the greatest respect to our Sydney Olympic Park, which has done a great job, particularly in the past few years under Charles Moore, it's really kicked on. But in London, they pre-planned the legacy before they even been to the Olympic Games. Here we sort of said, oh, what do we do at Olympic Park? We better do something with it. And we've been retrofitting ever since. They premeditated it and they've stuck to it and curated it the whole way through the outcome they've got. And we need to be better at that, including not only in the physical buildings of an Olympic Park, but in the job legacy, the skills training, the way you can take our SMEs at Western Sydney up a level so they can properly supply the tier one contractors. So the supply chain of the magnificent international tenants at Aerotropolis can work with local suppliers throughout Western Sydney to provide the widgets they need and the services they require. As I said to the Premier last night, $100 billion, we've got to get more bang for our buck, more fundamental change that will come from that. The third learning was a fascinating one, particularly out of Canary Wharf, this concept that foreign investors have less geographic prejudice than locals. And we saw that when the audacious move of Canadians to build Canary Wharf, the English banks didn't want to know a part of it. They weren't leaving the City of London, despite how cramped it was, rising damp, can't move. A couple of good little pubs is nice, but it's a dysfunctional place to get around the City of London and rents through the roof. They wouldn't take lower rents and go to Canary Wharf on big floor plates and brand new buildings because their existing geographic and cultural bigotry and prejudice was so great, they couldn't imagine going to the east. I have to look here and say quietly, it was things like NAB's the one that's gone west. A Melbourne bank has gone to Western Sydney, whereas the two Sydney banks, Commonwealth Bank buggered off from Western Sydney and went to Redfern. NAB came in. The Aerotropolis is now full of international firms who've signed MOUs, Japanese, American, etc., very few locals. I think we're seeing the same thing, that Western Sydney wants to go and find the best in the world. We might have to look outside Eastern Sydney to start with because they don't come with the same prejudice hurdles that others have. They also saw at Canary Wharf that the big name franchise brands, newsagents, coffee shops didn't want to come, didn't want to know it. But they went and found the guy with the local paper run and put him into a news agency, and he's now one of the richest merchants in London. They found the local coffee cart and backed them in when the big name brands didn't want to know about it. So it's instructive for us. Where do we find our tenants, our investors for the future? They're probably in Western Sydney already, or they mightn't be in Sydney at all. Number 4, better access, communications, facilities lead to richer lives. Now they can manifest at the upper end where the people of Woolwich and Greenwich and Shadwell and Stratford and Barking got access to a Docklands Light Rail. For all the best intentioned welfare programs in the world, if you can't get to the job, you can't do the job that's come available. So transport as a social transformative vehicle was made very clear to us, the Jubilee line, the Docklands Light Rail. Get them into, before you can take the jobs to there, you've got to get the people to the jobs. It's a process for us. And probably the most poignant part of the entire trip for me was we took the whole cohort to Royal London Hospital, now rebuilt as probably the biggest hospital in Europe, magnificent space on the side of the old hospital, which used to house the Elephant Man. That's been going for that long as a fundamental feature of the East End. And the latest development, and reminds you that sometimes the biggest kit in the world isn't what you need. Maybe it's the smallest piece of infrastructure reform. But being told about the new internal waiting room built in the sexual health clinic at Royal London Hospital, so the Bangladeshi women don't have to line up in the rain outside waving at their neighbours as they stand to get treated for an appointment in there. and the dignity that's brought just by that, the privacy and dignity that came from simply having an eternal waiting room in the new hospital is, is a reminder to all of us the scale of big and small scale infrastructure. Number 5, and I think for all of us, the biggest learning of the entire trip was to learn that London has 30+% of its population living in social affordable housing. We don't. It's not because they're poorer than us, they're just better catered for than we are. We also saw that scale matters. It really does matter. The 2 biggest public housing firms in London, I think, both have a P&L bigger than Mercedes-Benz globally. I mean, that's some serious scale. As one said to me proudly, that was their thing. The other one said, we like to prefer to say we provided $1 billion subsidy last year to our public housing tenants of what they'd pay in market rent. Whichever way you cut it, scale matters. They've had ambition, they had partnership with government. We cannot maintain an incremental approach to social affordable housing if we expect the people of Western Sydney to have somewhere to live. We've got to change that. Our last one out of that was simply a reminder that we don't have to be supplicant to East London either. There's plenty Western Sydney can teach East London, which is a nice reminder that we might be rookies in this process. We've got plenty right to start with. Western Sydney Uni was matched with its partner, University of East London, who, when I met them in April, said, we're so desperate to meet Western Sydney. They're our model, they're our hero. That's how we want to take our community, a university that came together from community colleges bundled into one regional advocate. And to watch them marvel at what Western Sydney had achieved in the region was amazing too. To see that groups like UCL are following Sydney Uni to go, the sandstone unis of downtown London, going to East London now to set up new campuses and following what ours have done previously with Sydney Uni's long-standing space at Westmead, and hopefully to get bigger and better. We saw that the NHS, the famed NHS public health system, can learn a thing or two from our hospital administrators, for whom they had no idea of why we cared about the hospital's impact on economic development or urban form. Whereas if you're in Western Sydney, you know the new hospital's the shiniest bit of kit you've got in that city for smart jobs, for good design, for public access. So they're yet to look outside their boundaries of the hospital, beyond the public health issues, to the wider implications that ours have been doing so magnificently at Blacktown, Westmead, Liverpool, Campbelltown, Bankstown, etc. Nepean. The great GLA in London, the GSC here, both pound for pound, wonderful strategic planners doing their thing and having a strong focus. But there's nothing like the Aerotropolis investment attraction process in East London that's driving smart jobs. And lastly, in that one, the dialogue was proud to be asked by the people of East London, can you please tell us how we can do all this lobbying to get East London going again, which was kind of nice to have our cohort sitting around advising these people that we thought were our heroes in it, saying we've lost the capacity for collective advocacy and they need to reframe it. So of all that, just quickly, what were some of the recommendations for Western Sydney? What do we take out of it? Obviously, value capture, and more value capture. Let us have a role, get the private sector in, sit around the tables. Give us a seat at the city deals. I mean, the city deal's wonderful. 3 levels of government working together to reshape the Western City, that's great. There's not a single engagement with a single person in the community or the private sector as part of that process. That has to change. We've got to find a way in governance to bring the best of both worlds together. We've got to get the collaboration going. And it's on us. It's not only on governments. We'll be launching something early next year, a collaborative leadership program, try and help Western Sydney embed that culture of collaborative leadership in the emerging leaders right across the region. So look forward for more of that to come. Secondly, we've got to measure it better, set some targets, be more ambitious on social targets. The convergence that Tim Williams spoke about in the East London process, where every mile you went east didn't have to take a year off your life. We need to make sure there is serious metrics that all governments, and metrics the private sector can buy and be challenged to meet as well by government. It's not just them. And importantly, in those wonderful cost-benefit ratios, don't you love when government sits down and does the highest and best use and runs it through the mill? Well, how about some of the social benefit getting a real seat at that table when we measure the benefit of any major project? Economic development, the obvious ones. Extend the airport rail now to go the whole hog, get north-south. Let's not build a half-assed program. Let's not have a 20-hour train servicing a 24-hour airport either. How's that going to work when you land? Oh, it's great, I've landed at a 24-hour airport, but the train doesn't start again until 6. I mean, there's not going to connect. Or your airport train does, but when it connects at St Mary's, that train doesn't start till 6. We've got to think longer and wider about that. And we've got to seriously focus on our health and education precincts to curate. Lastly, some little ones. SBS to Bankstown are obvious. Sydney Uni to Westmead. build the convention centre at Olympic Park. Western Sydney deserves its own convention centre. Get WSU and ensconced in Olympic Park as well. Be better at community engagement. Do the compact. Yes, skyscrapers all you like around metro stations with great public spaces and jobs and trees downtown, but let's get Harry Triggerboff out of the suburbs. Let people's suburban homes be comfortable. Manage population and congestion in the suburbs and try and magnify the impact of growth where it can be best handled in the downtown areas of Western Sydney. Don't have your grandmother's house being bulldozed for a 3-storey apartment every time you turn around. The legacies, the apprenticeships. Big public projects, the only place we're really going to get major apprenticeships, we've got to keep doing that and enshrining it in all public procurement processes. Just as we have to, as I said last night, reinvest in TAFE, reform TAFE and reinvest in TAFE. If we're going to change the social fabric of Western Sydney, if we're going to proclaim a BOOMTOWN that has suburbs of 25% youth unemployment, we failed. TAFE is going to be the way out of that mostly, and we need to invest in that strongly. And in the skills of SMEs, as I said, bring them up to a level they can play with global corporations. Social housing, spoke about last night, 30%. If we're going to build metro, big towers around metro stations, well, government, be true to your word. Incrementalism is not working in public housing and social housing, community housing transition. Let's go bold around metro stations. We'll let you go as high as you like, but make sure 30% of it's social and affordable housing within. Build capacity of the forums themselves. We all need to rally around to make sure all of the community housing forums have all the expertise on their boards, their management they can have, because I want them to do a deal instantly and get $5 billion worth of public housing transferred to there for them to manage. We cannot keep doing it bit by bit. We have to make a step change if we're going to affect that. So as a quick around the bases for a 5-day tour, I'm whipping through it. I think on your tables are some copies of that report. We encourage everybody to be part of that because we've got to keep learning in this journey. It's got a long time to go in this process. London's been doing it for 30 years, so they've got plenty to go, as we do. We want to keep learning from the best in the world, to learn that sometimes we are also the best in the world, and together I think we can drive that forward. So it was a wonderful journey and appreciate it.